Her blood found the snow before she did. It moved ahead of her in a thin, dark line, patient as water finding its level, and Della followed it the way she had been following everything for 3 days, without choosing, without stopping, because stopping was the same as dying, and dying was the only thing left that she refused to give them. The arrow was still in her side, halfway out, halfway in. She had pulled it that far herself, alone in the dark with her teeth clenched and the cold ground against her cheek, and then her hands had stopped working, and she had lain there until the cold made her stand again or made her nothing, and she had chosen to stand. The creek was frozen at its edges. She knelt at the center current and drank, and the cold of it spread through her chest, and she thought, not yet. She did not hear the horse. She heard the man drop from it, the particular sound of boots landing on snow-packed earth, and then she was on her feet with a branch in her hand, and the world tilting, and the place in her side where the arrow sat sending fire up through her ribs into her shoulder, and she held the branch and she stood. He was tall. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he had gone still, completely still, both hands away from his body, rifle still in the scabbard, not reaching, not advancing, in the way that a man goes still when he understands that something in front of him is not prey but a creature with its own calculus of survival. She had seen men make that stillness before. It was usually the last thing they calculated before they stopped calculating. "Easy," he said. His voice was low, not soft low the way stone is low without performance. "I'm not going to hurt you." She kept the branch up. He looked at her side. She watched him look at it, watched the thing that moved across his face, which was not pity. She knew pity's face well enough. It was something else, something she didn't have a word for in his language or her own. "That arrow needs to come out," he said. "You know that." She knew that. "I've got a place, 20 minutes on horseback." He tilted his head toward the animal behind him, a bay mare, dark-legged, watching her with the incurious patience of a horse that had seen hard mornings before. "Nobody's there but me." The branch in her hand was shaking, not because she was afraid, because her arm had run out of the thing that made it hold still. She lowered it, not because she trusted him, because the arrow was in her side and the militia was behind her and her arm had run out, and these were the facts, and she had always made her decisions from facts. He came toward her slowly, the way you move toward a hawk with a broken wing, and when he put his hands on her she felt the warmth of them through her torn clothing, and there had been hands once, warm like that, and the morning had been cold like this, and they had not been careful. But these were careful. These moved with a kind of attention she did not know how to account for, lifting her without wrenching, bearing her weight without comment, and she did not know what to do with careful, so she did nothing. She held herself apart inside his arms and let him carry her to the horse. She felt him feel her holding herself apart. He didn't try to close the distance. He settled her in front of him in the saddle, and she braced herself against the pommel, and he kept one arm just at the edge of her, close enough to catch her if she fell, not touching unless she fell. They rode. The pain moved through her in tides. Between tides she watched the country, the flat winter prairie, the sky the color of old pewter, the distant smudge of tree line. She mapped it. Old habit. She had been mapping exits since she was 7 years old. He said, "My name's Cole." She said nothing. "You don't have to tell me yours." She didn't. 15 minutes out he slowed and said, quietly, "Riders." And she felt him shift behind her, and then she heard them, militia horses, 4 or 5, moving fast on a parallel line 200 yards east. He turned the mare into a dry creek bed, and they stood in the shadow of the cutbank, and she could hear the men's voices carrying on the cold air, easy and careless, the voices of men who were not afraid of the land they were riding through. Her blood was dripping off the horse's shoulder onto the snow, small dark drops. She watched them and thought, if they come this way. But Cole had already calculated it. She felt it in the quality of his stillness, which was not panic, not performance. It was simply the stillness of a man running numbers. He had angled the mare so her dark flank faced the rider's line. He had put his own coat over Della's side. The drops disappeared into shadow. The militia passed. She let out a breath she'd been holding since before she'd found the creek, since before the arrow, since before the morning 3 days ago that had taken everything else. And the breath left her body, and for one moment she had nothing left inside her at all. "Almost there," Cole said. The cabin was small and low and set against a rise that blocked the north wind. He got her inside and onto a cot near the wood stove and built the fire up without speaking, and she lay there and watched the ceiling and counted the logs in the rafters, 14, and noted the door, the window, the second window behind her, small but passable. He came to the cot with clean cloth and a knife he'd held in the flame. "This is going to be bad," he said. "I know," she said, first words. Her voice came out scraped and foreign to her own ears, like something that had been packed away too long. He worked. She didn't make a sound. That was not bravery. She had simply learned a long time ago that sound did not help and sometimes made things worse. And her body had learned it so thoroughly that even now, with his hands doing necessary violence to her side, the quiet came of its own accord. The arrow came out in one pull, clean. And the pain was enormous, and then it settled and she was still on the cot, still in the ceiling rafters, 14. He bound the wound tightly and stepped back. Not 2 steps, not 1. He stepped back to the far edge of the small cabin and turned to the wood stove, and she had the cot and the wall and all the space between them. She hadn't expected that, the stepping back. She looked at the arrow on the floor, halfway pulled already, before he'd ever touched her. She had been pulling it herself. That was the fact she returned to later, when she tried to account for why she didn't run that first night. She had been pulling it herself, and she'd still needed help. She did not run, not yet. She counted exits before she opened her eyes. She did it the way she breathed, without deciding to, without being able to stop. The window behind her, the window to the east, the door. She counted them in the dark with the wood stove still going and the smell of wood smoke and something else, lye soap, the sharp, clean animal smell of it. And something moved through her that she pushed back down before it finished moving. The last man who had cleaned her wound had done it slowly, had made her watch, had explained while he worked what she owed him for the trouble. She opened her eyes. Cole was at the table with coffee, his back to her, looking out the east window at the first gray of dawn. He hadn't heard her wake, or he'd decided not to mark it. She watched the back of his head for a moment, the dark hair, the particular angle of a man looking at something in the middle distance that isn't quite the thing he's looking at, and then she took inventory of herself. Wound bound. Her weapons gone, she'd had nothing left to take. Her moccasins still on. That was something. She sat up. He turned then, not fast, and said, "Coffee." She looked at the cup in his hand. "It's just coffee," he said. "No reason to make it something else." She said nothing. He poured a second cup and set it on the table and sat back down and looked out the window again. She got up. The wound pulled. She crossed to the table and took the cup and went back to the cot and sat with it. She didn't drink it yet. She wrapped both hands around the tin and let the heat come through her palms, and the heat of it moved along her fingers and up her wrists, and she sat with it and watched him. He didn't ask her anything. She had been waiting for the questions. They always came. Where are your people? Where did you come from? Are there others? Where are you headed? The questions that were not really questions but a kind of inventory, a man counting what he might be owed or what he might be able to use. She sat on the cot and held the cup and waited for them. He drank his coffee and watched the window and said nothing. An hour later, a horse came up the road. She was on her feet before the sound fully registered, the wound objecting, her eyes on the door. Cole was already standing. He looked at her one look, quick, assessing, and said, "Back room, stay quiet." There was no back room. There was a curtain hung across the rear corner. She went behind it and stood against the wall and listened. Boot steps on the porch, a knock. "Danner," A man's voice, official in the way that men become official when they've been given a gun and a purpose. Militia, we're tracking an Apache. Woman, wounded, seen anything unusual. A pause. She heard Cole move to the door and open it, the cold air moving through the cabin in a single breath. Apache woman. Cole's voice was easy. The ease of it was a careful thing, not too easy, not too flat, just a man who had been asked a boring question before his second cup of coffee. Number came in last night, haven't been out since. What she wanted for? Resisting removal. Another pause. Mind if we look around? I mind, yeah, Cole said, still easy. I've got a sick calf in the barn and I don't need the disturbance. You want to come back with paperwork, be my guest, otherwise I've got work. The boot steps, the militia man deciding something. You see anything, you send word to Fort Benson. Sure will. The door closed. She stood behind the curtain and listened to Cole stand at the window watching the rider leave, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breath through her nose, steady, steady, and behind her sternum something sat, not fear, past fear, the thing that comes after fear when you have been afraid so long that fear has become architecture, has become the structure you live inside, and she breathed against it until it stopped pressing. He pulled the curtain aside. Gone, he said, alone, didn't see another one. She nodded. He went back to the stove. He made more coffee. He put a bowl of something on the table and didn't call her to it and didn't look at her and went outside. She looked at the bowl from across the cabin. She looked at the door he'd left through. She crossed to the table and sat and ate. It was cornmeal, plain, and she ate all of it and then sat with the empty bowl and listened to him moving around outside. The sounds of a man doing his ordinary work, splitting wood, the rhythmic thunk of it, then water from the pump, then nothing for a while. When he came back and she was on the cot, he glanced at the empty bowl and said nothing. He moved it to the wash basin. She watched him. The door. She had been looking at the door since he'd stepped outside. He'd left it unlatched. Anyone who did not want her to run would have latched it. She had stood at the open door for a long moment with the cold air coming in and the gray morning beyond and her wound like a fist in her side, and she had not run, and she was still accounting for that. Della, she said. He looked at her. My name. He said it back to her once, quietly, the way you say a word when you want to learn its weight. Then he nodded and went back to his work. One word, she had given him one. The horses knew her before he did. She had been in the barn 20 minutes before Cole came looking. She'd heard him find the empty cot, heard the pause, heard his boots on the frozen ground, and by then she was already in the corner stall with his most difficult horse, the gray, the one she'd clocked on her first morning watching through the window, the one that had pinned its ears at Cole and at the sound of the militia and at everything else that moved through its world. She had her forehead against its nose. The gray was breathing against her cheek. She heard Cole stop at the barn door. He didn't say anything. She felt him seeing it, her and the horse, the gray that nobody rode, and she felt him decide to say nothing. And she felt what that decision cost him, the effort of the silence, and that told her something she hadn't known before. She straightened and the gray nickered softly, and she moved to the next stall. There was work to do. The animals hadn't been well tended, not neglected, but a man alone does what he can, and what he can is never quite enough. She started with the water. He came in and started with the feed, working the opposite end, and they moved toward each other down the row of stalls without speaking, and she received the bucket he handed her without looking up, and he received the blanket she passed back without commenting on where she'd found it, and they worked. The warmth of the barn rose around them. The particular warmth of animals in a closed space, deep and alive and old. She knew this warmth. Her father had smelled of it on winter mornings, coming in from the horses before the sun was fully up, and she had stood at the door of their home and felt it come in with him, that warmth. Before they had taken his horses and taken the home and taken him, and left her with nothing but the memory of where the warmth lived, and what it cost. She ran a length of rope through her fingers, back and forth, the rough twist of it. Cole was beside her. He was wrapping a poultice around the gray's foreleg. The animal had a heat in the joints she'd noticed, and his hands moved with the same deliberate attention she'd felt on her own side 3 days ago. She watched his hands. They did not tremble. They did not move with the impatience of a man who considered this task beneath him. They moved as if the horse's leg was worth getting right. She had not seen many men move like that. She was coiling the rope when the wound reopened. She felt it before she registered what it was, a warmth at her side, a loosening, and she put her hand there and felt the damp spread against her palm. "Let me see," Cole said. He had seen it on her face, whatever her face had done. "It's fine. Let me see it." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was no argument in it, only the steadiness of a man making a reasonable request, and she had been looking for the thing behind the request, the leverage, the debt being set up, the price being named before the service, and she had been looking for 3 days and it was not there, and she was more frightened by its absence than she had been by its presence in other men, because she did not know what it meant and she did not have a framework for it. She moved her hand. He crouched beside her and unwrapped what she had there, and the wound was seeping at one edge, not dangerously, but enough. He rebandaged it without looking at her face. She watched his hands. The rope was still in her fingers, moving back and forth, the rough twist of it, something to hold. "You rode yesterday," he said, not accusing, just nodding. "No. The day before." She said nothing. He tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels. He was close enough that she could see the scar along his jaw, old and white, the record of something she didn't know. He looked at the binding, not at her, and she was grateful for that, and the gratitude sat at the base of her throat like something half swallowed, like the beginning of a door. "It'll hold," he said. He stood and moved back to the gray. She ran the rope through her fingers, back then forward, the warmth of the barn, the sound of the horse breathing. "I was born near the Gila River," she said. He didn't turn around. "My father had horses, good horses." She paused. "They were taken." He was still, his hands on the gray's leg, listening in the way that a man who has also lost things listens, not waiting for the pause so he can speak, but simply present in the loss itself, standing in it alongside her. "I know about taking," he said finally, and that was all. She looked at the rope in her hands. Then she looked at him, at his back, the width of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself near the animal that didn't trust anyone. She told him her name again, but this time it wasn't one word. This time it was the whole of it, Della Runningwaiter, the name her father had given her, the one she had not said aloud to another person in almost a year, the one she had been keeping like a coal kept under ash to stay alive. He turned then. He said the whole of it back to her, both words, the same careful weight. Something at the base of her throat, half a centimeter, like a door. They came before dawn. She felt them first, the particular pressure of the dark that changes when it has people moving through it. And she was sitting up on the cot before she decided to sit up, her hand reaching for the wall beside her where there was nothing, where a weapon should have been. 3 horses, she counted the hoofbeats 3. Cole was already awake. She could tell by the quality of the silence from his side of the cabin. He was awake and still, waiting to be sure of what he was hearing. Then he was up and at the window, and the gray pre-dawn light caught his face, and she read what was there. Not good. "Militia," he said low. She was already moving. The back of the cabin, she'd mapped it on day one. Day one she had mapped all of it, the cook stove, the crate of provisions beside it, and behind the provisions, resting against the wall, his spare rifle. She'd noted it. She'd noted everything. She crossed to it without making light and took it up and checked the load by touch in the dark, her fingers reading the mechanism the way her father had taught her before she could read words. Loaded. She found the hunting knife on the shelf above the cot, heavy, good steel, and tucked it into her belt. Cole looked at her across the dark cabin. She looked back. She could feel the wound in her side, awake and objecting, and she set the pain aside the way she'd learned to set things aside, placed it somewhere behind her where it could stay until she needed to return to it. The horses stopped outside, boot steps multiple. Danner, same voice as before, not the same easy morning inquiry. Something harder in it now, something that had been given permission. Open up. We have information you're harboring a fugitive. Cole's jaw set, she watched it. I'll go out, he said to her, very quiet. No, she said. He looked at her. They'll take the conversation wherever they want it if you go to them. She kept her voice below sound. They come in here, the space is yours. He absorbed this. She saw him absorb it, not immediately, not the way a man does when he already agrees, but with a genuine working through of it which she respected. The boot steps crossed the porch. Now, she said, and Cole opened the door. 3 of them, she'd been right. The one in front was big and held himself the way men hold themselves when they've decided the outcome before they've walked through the door. Behind him, 2 younger ones, rifle hands, watching the corners. Cole filled the doorframe. Little early, he said. Step aside, Danner. Tell me what you're looking for first. I told you, Apache woman. I told you, nobody here. The big one looked past Cole into the cabin, looking for shadows, for the shape of a second person. His eyes were moving in a practiced way. He'd done this before. She could see that. And she was standing at the far side of the cook stove where the shadow was deepest, and her wound was a fist in her side, and she had the rifle and the knife, and she breathed. A boot on the threshold, the big one not asking now. Cole didn't move. You're obstructing militia business, Danner. I'm standing in my own house. The big one put his hand on Cole's shoulder to move him. Cole's hand came up and caught the wrist, not violently, just. No, and in the half-second that followed, when the big man's attention was entirely on Cole and his hand, Della stepped out of the shadow. She didn't hide the rifle. She didn't raise it either. She held it at her side and stood in the center of the cabin in the gray dawn light, and looked at the 3 of them with the specific flatness in her face that she had learned from the years of men who thought she couldn't look back. The 2 younger ones went still. The big man turned. She let him look. The thing in her chest at the center of her ribs between them, where the bones made their cage, did not have a name yet. It was new and it was there, and it was related to the fact that Cole was between her and these men and she had not put him there. He had put himself there. She had found that out this morning, watching him stand in the doorframe. He had put himself there. You shoot me, she said, and everyone within 10 miles hears it. Danner reports it. You want to explain to Fort Benson why you shot a woman in a rancher's cabin. She let that sit. Or you can leave and say you found nothing. The big man looked at Cole. Cole looked back, nothing in his face but patience. The sound of the morning, wind in the dry grass, the horses outside moving against their bits. A door broken down, a different morning. She had not put herself between anything that morning. She had been what they came through the door for, and there had been no one standing between her and it. And there never had been, not once in her life before this. The quality of the light through the splintered frame, the particular cold of that air. She had breathed it for years. She breathed it now. She breathed through it and stood. The big man stepped back. The 2 younger ones pulled back with him. She saw the relief in them. They were not men who wanted the morning she was offering. And the boot steps crossed the porch again, and the horses moved, and the sound of them went south and then went away. Silence. Cole turned. She was still standing in the center of the cabin with the rifle at her side. She could feel her hands now. They had gone cold somewhere in the middle of it, and the cold was coming back into them like sensation returned to a numbed thing. And the wound was very loud, and the thing in her chest was still there between the ribs, new and unnamed. He was looking at her. Not with gratitude, not with the expansive relief of a man who has been rescued. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the barn that first morning, as if she were something worth seeing clearly. She set the rifle against the wall, the small sound of it settling into place, and then the cabin was quiet. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the room and breathed, and the dawn came through the east window, and the wood stove was cold and needed building, and there was cornmeal for the morning, and 3 men had ridden away, and she had stayed. Not because she couldn't run. She had a rifle, she had a knife, she had mapped every exit on day 1. She stayed. She was still standing there when Cole went to the stove and began building the fire. She watched his back, the particular width of his shoulders, the careful way his hands moved, the same care as the horse's leg, as the wound at her side, as the arrow that had needed to come all the way out. The fire caught. The warmth began to move through the cabin, and she stood in the path of it and let it.